Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Gathering Place. My name is Rachel Gerber, and I am the editor of The Gathering Place and the denominational minister for Christian Formation for Mennonite Church USA. Every month on The Gathering Place, we focus on a new theme, and this theme, today we are talking about race and racism in the church, and we're so excited to have Drew Hart with us today. So Drew is an assistant professor of theology at Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania, and he is an author and a blogger and a theologian, and most recently has written the book Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism. And we are absolutely delighted to have you here today, Drew, talking with us. So would you like to just jump on in and get us started?
Absolutely. Thank you again for inviting me to share with everyone, and I'm just looking forward to our conversation at the end as well. So we'll just be looking at the theme, which is racialized society in the way of Jesus, and hopefully that will make more sense why I titled it that for this presentation. So I occasionally get asked to have conversations with pastors and leaders, especially a lot when I lived in Philadelphia. I just recently moved to Harrisburg. And when I would do so, on one particular occasion, I met with a young pastor. He was a young white, excuse me, got a little cough, a young white pastor who was in his 30s, pastoring a church that I guess, had probably been around for about 5 years, but was growing pretty fast. He was a pretty, popular pastor and author, and he wanted to pick my brain around race and racism and what that meant for his own congregation and his own ministry. And so on this particular occasion, we were able to get together. It was like a hot summer afternoon, and so we met at like a McDonald's, and we had sweet teas. I always like joking about the sweet teas that, it's real sweet tea when you feel the sugar gritting through your teeth. So I enjoy that. It can't be good for my teeth, but despite what my dentist says, I enjoy them a lot. And so there we were this hot day, enjoying the sweet teas and just sharing our stories and our common experiences and divergent experiences as well. And partway through our conversation, he grabbed one of the cups, put them between us, and he was like, "Hey, Drew, you see this cup that's in between us? On one side of the cup, there's a logo, and on the other side of the cup, there's writings, and I can't see what's on your side of the cup, and you can't see what's on my side of the cup. And so I need you to help me see what's on your side of the cup, and you need me to help you see what's on my side of the cup." And so kind of was having like this kind of PBS moments, and it was kind of really sweet, and I was like, "Oh, that's so nice." But after he was done, I stopped him. I said, things just don't really work that way. That's just not the way things work. And so I began to proceed and explain that, in reality, I often already know what's on his side of the cup. And I explained that, I grew up even in mostly Black neighborhoods. I had mostly white teachers. I had to learn all about European, Eurocentric history and literature and all kinds of stuff. And when I went to college, I was the only Black male on my freshman floor. So I had to navigate that space and try to understand the cultural quirks and differences and many things I was not familiar with at all. Throughout my entire life, even, what I do today, the work that I do, I'm constantly engaging white audiences and have to kind of figure out what are white people thinking as they're listening to me, and oftentimes looking at my Black body in front of them. And so in various ways, and I could go on, but I've often had to navigate white dominant culture. I've had to understand it. I've had to understand the literature and the culture and the different quirks, and not that I'm an expert, because nobody's an expert, but I'm very aware of those realities. And so then I proceeded and I explained to my friend, I said, on the other hand, like, you go about your life and you can continue to go about your life and never like step foot in a Black community, and you will not be harmed because of that. You can continue to thrive, you can write your books, and you can not know anything about Black history, about the Black community, about the wide range of voices. You don't have to read any Black intellectual thought, Black poetry, any of that stuff, and you will be fine. And what I wanted to get my point across was that what we were talking about was more than just a cross-cultural exchange program, right? And that's sometimes how we talk about race, is that it's simply a matter of how do we each just give back and forth equally. And the reality is that because of race and the way that our society has been racialized, it's not an equal playing field, right? The terms are uneven. And so we have to account for the power dynamics. We have to account for the way that knowledge plays out with power and who's in majority and how that shapes our everyday lives. And so I think even before we even get started, just to remember that when we talk about race and racism, we're not just talking about cross-cultural exchange programs. Sometimes we kind of water down the actual realities of our society by thinking about it in those terms, but it's much more complex than that, and we have to account for the power dynamics. We have to account for racial hierarchy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So along those terms then, I often like to define what we mean when we say even words like racism, because I think often conversation breaks down very quickly when people use the word racism, and often people mean very different things when they use the term. So for example, I'd say that probably the common way that most people talk about racism is they mean it in a very individualistic level, right? I do not like you because of your race, or I'm prejudiced of you, or I hate you because of your race, right? And it's kind of like individual to individual kind of expression. And that in many ways is the common sentiment for how racism is talked about in our society often. And in some ways, yeah, that's the very definition that most people will probably find, like the first definition of most English dictionaries will probably have something kind of to that nature. And so that's a very common way that people are defining and using the word racism. But at the same time, there's another definition. So if that first definition is the common one, often say, in fact, let me just add, often make the point that, what you find in the dictionary isn't necessarily a reflection of the best way to use language. It's just a reflection of how we as human beings use the language already. So like selfie, right? That's in a lot of dictionaries now because thanks to my millennial peers, that's a term that we coined, Google, right? It's a verb now, not just a company. And so there's ways in which dictionaries just reflect the way that we use the language, not necessarily the best way to use the language. So with racism, if we were to go into the Department of Sociology, you're going to find a very different definition than the main way that people commonly use the word. And what you're going to find is a much more broader, systemic, structural way of thinking about racism. In many ways, I say that the way that most people use it is a very thin definition, but the way that, you'll find it and sociologists and critical race theorists, you'll have a very thicker definition of racism that makes sense of how our whole entire society is organized by race. So to that effect, I like to define racism. And so how I usually define it is this. Racism is a humanly constructed system that socializes people into their racial identities, biases, and practices, and it organizes our society by race in a way that structurally justifies advantaging white people for social dominance, or at the minimum, it provides people with a sense that whiteness is the mark of an exceptional people group. It overtly and subtly teaches members of society that white bodies, practices, traditions, and knowledges are normative, superior, and more valuable than non-white bodies. And so I think hopefully what you'll see in that definition is it's a system-wide way of thinking about race. Race, almost like if you were to think about capitalism, right? Capitalism is a way of structuring our economy throughout our entire society so that we organize our lives around that particular way of life, right? Racism is the same thing. It's a way of organizing our society based on the idea of race, the ideology of race. And once you actually begin to systematize our entire society by race, then as we live our lives, we are socialized. That just becomes the norm. It begins to organize how we live our lives, right? So that it's no surprise that most people live very racially distinct lives, even though they don't think of it that way. And race also justifies, right, the way the world is. So if we see a disproportionate amount of Black people in prison, Race tells us, oh, there's a reason for that, right? Black people commit more crime. That's the theory, even if that's not necessarily the actual facts on the ground. And so it overall just teaches us so much. It's like a silent teacher throughout our lives. And so thinking about race as a system and not just an individual intents, right? Because sometimes when we make racism with the thinner definition, everything about intents, well, in some ways, who knows? Nobody knows anybody else's intents, right? And so it's not something concrete that anybody can really get a hold of, except for in maybe some of the most extreme cases. But when we're actually talking about racism in this kind of way, it's something actually very measurable and obvious, and it can't really be denied once you actually look at what's actually happening in our society, how it developed, and how it's widespread across our society. So there was a book. It's kind of old now, and when I say old, not that old, but it was early 21st century, and it was called Divided by Faith. It was written by two Christian sociologists. And they used the term racialized society. They weren't the only ones to use this, but I really appreciated how they talked about it in their book. And so I'll give you what they said, kind of moving towards thinking about racism systemically and structurally throughout society to actually just calling our society a racialized society. So they say the racialized society is one in which intermarriage rates are low, residential separation and socioeconomic inequality are the norm. Our definitions of personal identity and our choices of intimate associations reveal racial distinctiveness, and where we are never unaware of the race of the person with whom we interact, which is interesting. And then in short, and this is its unchanging essence, a racialized society is a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. And then finally they add, a racialized society can also be said to be a society that allocates differential economic, political, social, and even psychological rewards to groups along racial lines that are socially constructed, right? And so again, remembering that all of this is a socially constructed reality, that race is not actually biological in terms of that. The biological claims are a lie, but the reality that it actually shapes now our actual society and that we live by it, that's very real, right? So how do we account for those two things? And so that's what I mean when I talk about a racialized society. So I often like to talk about my own experience and how I kind of navigated and realized more and more that our society is racialized in a very complex way. And so I grew up in Norristown, which is an interesting place, a borough outside of Philly, but urban. And it's like a third Black, a third white, a third Latino. And that was just the kind of dynamics of Norristown. And I can remember just on one, excuse me, on one hand, Norristown was very racially segregated in some ways, like these pockets and stuff. And in other ways, it was very integrated, like everybody went to school and you're gonna cross paths, right? Because it's a town of 35,000 people or so. And so it was just those kind of dynamics between the two. And so you could see how, on one hand, while Black people were disproportionately more likely to be poor, there were other folks who were like white, obviously, for example, that were poor, right? And most white people were more likely to be wealthy, but there were some Black middle class there. So it was complex, the ways that we saw race and class clash together. But there were still some very self-evident racial lines that were kind of built into the life of the city. In many ways, growing up, though, I often felt kind of normal in the grand scheme of things. Like, I didn't feel like I stood out. I wasn't the cool kid. I wasn't, ignored and, rejected either. But I just kind of fit in and went about my business and didn't really probably think about it that much growing up. Well, when I was about 15, we had a fire. Right before I was 15, we had a fire at our house, and my dad had in the past few years before that had become a pastor at a church outside of Philadelphia in the suburbs. And so we actually moved to be closer to the church. It was a Black congregation out in Montgomery County. And so starting in 10th grade, I found myself attending North Penn High School, which was like this enormous. That's literally the pictures of North Penn, an enormous school. And it was 1,000 kids, 1,000 kids per grade, 10th through 12th grade. So it was 3,000 kids. And so I remember ahead of time, because I was at least familiar with the school beforehand, I was just like terrified of going to North Penn, terrified of what it was going to be like. If anybody's ever watched the show Everybody Hates Chris, like that's kind of like what I imagined, that the black kid would get picked on at the white school. And so I get there though, and my own prejudice and pre-ideas of what was going to happen were not real. You know, they were my own presumptions of what was going to take place. And so when I got there, I found that people did not pick on me at all because I was black. That was not the case at all. But yet race was still shaping that space. It still was a racialized space. And what I began to realize is that I would show up certain places, like at the basketball courts, and I would get like picked first before people had even seen me play. And I was like, oh, okay, cool, that sounds good. You know, at the time, I just thought like, well, they know what's up. Clearly people had not known before, but now they do. And so, but obviously, you know, those kind of things happen over and over again. People just kind of giving you instant credibility as a cool kid, right? Or you're a bad boy or whatever, because they knew that I was from Norristown. And so there's ways in which this was in many ways a very racialized space, but not in the way that I had imagined or thought about. And so even though I was the same person, same looks, same body, everything, when I moved into this space, my body now was being reinterpreted in this particular space as cool, right? Coolness somehow just was oozing from me, even though I hadn't changed at all, same personality. So I had to kind of make sense of what was going on there at North Penn. At the time, I thought that these were positive, you know, but looking back, I can see how negative a lot of these stereotypes were that have a lot of expectations for you in terms of, you know, athleticism or whatever, but not necessarily intellectually, right? High expectations for young black men, especially. Then towards the end of my time, I ended up deciding to go to a Christian college, Messiah College, and it was about 2 hours away. I was excited because, you know, I would finally get a chance to grow in my faith alongside of my brothers and sisters in Christ. And so there I found myself suddenly in, what was that, 2000, at this Christian college. And I knew it was a majority white school, but I wasn't really worried about it because I had already done a majority white school at North Penn. So this should be easy because you just add Christ, right? And it should be a lot easier than anything else. I got there and I actually had some pretty serious culture shock, and it was a little worried my first couple weeks that I had made a bad decision. I think some of it, you know, some of it's probably just normal homesickness. Some of it also was just feeling a little alienated. I was literally the only black male on my floor my first year, and so navigating that space, trying to figure out how I fit in. Was initially challenging, but I was still a pretty outgoing kid. And so I made friends and I reached out and I, in some ways you could say I thrived. Like I was able to make friendships throughout campus, and it was pretty well known. Maybe it's easy to be well known when you're one of the few black students on campus. But while I was there, you know, so in fact, I joke that, you know, they used to call me the Godfather. Especially in my dorm, because I was, you know, known for pulling all the pranks and, you know, all kinds of stuff. And so it was literally my nickname at the time. But so my first couple of years there, I didn't really, excuse me, talk about racism too much on campus. I was hyper aware that I was, you know, very much a minority on campus. And I think to kind of cope with that, I usually just made silly, you know, racial jokes about my big black fridge in my room and this and that, you know, really dumb things that I guess young people do. But as time would go on, I began to really struggle with the way in which, the way that I began to see how I was being perceived by others on campus. I began to notice just the strange way when I would walk up into a group and enter into conversation with maybe some friends that I knew who were also there with folks that didn't know me, and the strange way I would be perceived. I noticed the way that students on campus began, like, I noticed like students calling other Black students, and particularly Black male students, thugs, and really being troubled by that term being used constantly on campus to describe Black men. I know, the way that Black women would feel like people would touch their hair without, respecting their body and their space, just very disrespectful. And just over and over again, and realizing that suddenly that people were perceiving me often, not all the time, but often as a threat, right? As someone to be worried of, if they didn't know me already. And so this just became like an overwhelming experience for me. And I often say it was like 1,000 paper cuts, where the initial paper cuts, it was no big deal, but after like 1,000, you really hurt like hell in some ways. And so it was just became a really hard time. By the time junior and senior year, I just felt like I had to deal with this a little more explicitly, realizing that something again had happened, right? That though it wasn't like Norristown where I was normal, and it wasn't like North Penn where I was racially gazed on as cool, but a racial gaze had taken place where I was dangerous, and many other bodies, Black bodies, were also seen in a similar way. And so in light of that, I began to realize all the different ways that our society was racialized, and in complex ways, right? Not in a stuck, it just didn't work the same way in each space. And that I had to kind of remain attentive to how race was working and moving in those different spaces. And in some ways, that while I realized race was always happening, it seemed, and yet at the same time, not always in the same way. And so it really demanded for me to pay attention to my surroundings and what was going on. So one of the ways that I talk about thinking about our racialized society then is to respond to the accusation sometimes that Black people get that we're always playing the race card, right? And so one of the ways that I think about that is to think about if the race card is this idea that we're always interpreting these moments, everyday moments, as racial moments when they're not racial moments, then I want us to think about what does it mean to consider the whole entire deck. If, for example, we know historically that we have hundreds of years of racial history, right? Slavery from 1619 to 1865, followed by, Black codes and Jim Crow and white supremacy, KKK, 5,000 lynchings, right? All this after the Civil War, up through the mid-20th century, convict leasing systems, all that, right? Sharecropping. And then followed by that, in more recent times, from the 70s onward, the growth of mass incarceration and all that stuff. Like, we can see historically that race, that we have a racialized history. We can also see widespread throughout our society that race continues to shape everyday life experiences. We can see how disproportionate, for example, mass incarceration system is, right? We can see statistics. People do research all the time. If you can look on the screen, the bottom left, it talks about the impact on criminal records and race as it relates to people getting callbacks for interviews, and seeing like the different ways that race shapes people's experiences. So if someone has, in that example, 34% of white men without a conviction had a positive response in the initial stage of the process. White men with a conviction, however, it dropped to 17%. So convictions have a huge impact on people's lives. But then Black men without a conviction had 14% positive response, which that alone should be very troubling. That means that Black men without a conviction are actually having a harder time in the employment process than white men with a conviction. And then, of course, Black men with a conviction had a 5% positive response. And so you just see the kind of really radical way in which race, you add race to something and it deeply impacts how people can go about their lives and thrive in our society or struggle through our society. And so what I guess my point would be is that we have a deeply racialized society, and that's just a few examples of how race shapes our everyday lives. And so if that's the case, then my suggestion when people say, you know, you're playing the race card is that if anything, you know, people who are making that accusation probably are more likely to be the ones playing the race card because they're only looking at an individual card and assessing in and of itself whether they think it's racial or not. And I think what we see oftentimes in the Black community is that people are remembering their history. They have a much greater sense of historical memory around, you know, not only their own lived experience, but their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents and such. And much more than that, then also what's going on widespread throughout their neighborhood and their community. So what are the experiences of their friends and their peers and through things that are happening all around them in their neighborhood. And so like a deck of cards, imagine laying out a deck of cards and seeing 4 aces, 4 kings, 4 queens, you know, jacks, all the different numbers, spades, hearts. And so you begin to see all these patterns. And then if somebody were to take out one card and you were to look at it and assess it, you could make sense of that card and how it fits in the larger deck. And I think when a lot of racial events, moments spark up, Black people are analyzing one individual card in light of the whole deck, right? History and widespread patterns throughout our society. And too often those in the majority culture are only assessing it on the individual card without anything else to kind of frame as a frame of reference to decide whether something is racial or not. And so I think it's a different way of kind of looking and thinking about how our society is racialized. And when we can see the broad patterns throughout our society, it's much easier to understand how we can look at individual moments. I think it's also important for us to understand that when we're talking about race at all, we have to talk about race in terms of racial hierarchy, right? And what I mean by that is, is that there's a hierarchy from recognizing whiteness is everything good in the world and Blackness is everything bad. And I think one of the great ways to think about this is in terms of the Clark doll experiments from the 1940s. What they did was that they'd have like one Black kid or one white kid at a child at a time, and they would show them a Black doll and a white doll and ask them which doll is the ugly doll, which doll is the beautiful doll, which doll is the good doll, which doll is the bad doll, right? And most of the white kids, not surprising, in the 1940s, they would, you know, pick the white doll for all positive attributes and the Black doll for all negative attributes. The reason why we kind of remember these experiments is more because of the choices that the Black children made. Instead of this idea of reverse discrimination, which gets talked about a lot, what happened at this time was that Black kids were asked the same questions, you know, which doll is the ugly one? And they'd point to the Black doll. Which doll is the bad doll, right? And they point to the Black doll. And then they'd also be asked, you know, which doll looks most like you? And after they've given all these negative attributes, so many of them would point to the Black doll as well. And so you'd see how they had, so many of these kids had internalized racial hierarchy, right? Just like the white kids, because they're all human beings in a deeply racialized society. And though it wasn't usually to the same extent as the white kid, usually it was a little bit more intense in terms of the depth of their racial hierarchy and white supremacy that they had internalized. It was still very present. Now, of course, that was the 1940s, but you know, this study has been kind of reduplicated many times in the 21st century, and oftentimes people see a lot of the same patterns, white kids and Black kids, and in fact, many times, sometimes with more nuance and space for Latino, brown, all that kind of stuff, and they're still seeing real patterns of internalizing racial hierarchy in that same kind of way. So when people talk about white supremacy, then what we're talking about is not just about KKK, right? That's usually what people think of when you hear the word white supremacy, but it's really just to talk about racial hierarchy, that whiteness is presumed to always be good, everything good and innocent and beautiful in the world. And then within that, then the opposite is this idea that Blackness is bad, right? Anti-Blackness as a reoccurring sentiment throughout our society. And so that is one of the ways that we see race actually play out in our society, is that it's not a neutral thing, that there is hidden within our 400 years of white supremacy in our society. It shapes and we internalize these ideas and do so often unconsciously, so that people don't often realize that we're just in subtle ways, every one of us, just because we're human beings in a society with 400 years of racial history, we just internalize these ideas, maybe to different degrees, each of us, but it's just a part of the human experience to to be internalizing these things in some sort. So if we're going to think more broadly then about some of these patterns, I think some of the ways that we can see that is certainly around police brutality and racial profiling. And I think, again, to think both widespread across our society, but also think historically about these things help us get some insight into what's going on today. So a lot of people think that the issues that are going on today are new things, but in reality, they've been going on for a long time. So from 1920 to 1932, more than half of all African Americans killed by white people were killed by police officers, right? And so that's something that is not new to our world today. The majority of Black community riots from 1943 to 1972 were precipitated by Black people being killed or harassed by police, right? So these riots that were going on regularly, there's always been these kind of responses. Even how people are responding today are not new. I mean, the kind of way that it gets publicized on television is new. But these are issues that have been of deep concern for the Black community for a very long time. In 1999, 42% of the Black community reported having been racially profiled. You know, you're approaching almost 50%. Meanwhile, 72% of young Black men reported having been racially profiled, right? So in 1999, about 70% of Black men reported being racially profiled. That's a huge, devastating number to be thinking about. And then finally, I think what's really important to be thinking about is the idea of stop and frisk, which is even still today a conversation that people still don't understand the reality of what's going on. So from 2010 to 2012, it was actually a university study, and they looked at New York City's stop and frisk practices. And what they found was that 84% of the stop and frisks were comprised of Blacks and Latinos, but only 6% resulted in actual arrests, right? And so they had policies where they were targeting particular neighborhoods, Black and brown neighborhoods, and saying pretty much that they needed to, you know, stop and frisk was the standard way to deal with cutting down crime. But what they were actually doing was harassing over and over and over again innocent people walking just in their neighborhood, getting harassed, getting brutalized, getting humiliated every day in their own community. And with all that stop and frisk going on, only 6% actually resulted in anything. It's a tiny fragment to be harassing an entire community around. And so I think we don't realize, again, there's reasons why there's so much frustration, I think, in many communities around policing in their communities. And that's because there's more people being harassed who haven't done anything at all, who are being brutalized, who are being humiliated in their communities, than there's actually stopping at least what people are setting out to do. Nonetheless, we could question whether those tactics are even good ones anyway, but certainly it's not successful. And I think it also begs the question, you know, people always talk about the police intuition, right? Just trusting police intuition as though they're somehow more than human and just know who the criminals are, right? They just have the gut for it. But you know, when you actually look at these kind of stats, you realize that no, they're just humans like everybody else, and they really don't know just from their gut who is, you know, a suspect, a worthy suspect, and who is not. But moving even beyond those tactics, just thinking about how the criminal justice system worked itself. Between 2001 and 2010, police made no fewer than 8.2 million arrests for marijuana. About 88% of that was for simple possession, right? So nonviolent drug offenses. A Black person is 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than a white person, even though Blacks and whites use marijuana at similar rates, right? And so there's been all kinds of studies. That's not the only one that shows that that Blacks and whites are using drugs at similar rates, and yet they're way more likely to be arrested for that. And maybe as anecdotal point, since I've lived in Harrisburg, Philly, and Northtown, which are primarily Black and brown communities, and also in North Penn and Grantham, at least for a little while. I've never seen stop and frisks happening in white neighborhoods that I've lived in. I've never seen people constantly being harassed and searched for drugs in any white neighborhood that I've been a part of. And so it's not surprising to see these numbers and how it plays out. And it's part of it is because the way that we police is very different in different communities. Finally, there are steep racial disparities and this kind of gets at that point better, deep disparities in the policing and criminal justice system. At every single stage in the system, there are racial disparities, from policy and expectations in varying geographies to actual policing and surveillance practices, to which bodies are stopped and searched frequently, to who's actually arrested, to the severity of the sentencing, right? What kind of punishment you get. And even after someone serves all their time, there still can be legally discriminated against for the rest of their lives because you got to check the box, and many times you can't get government housing and all kinds of stuff. And so you have this huge system in place where we see, I mean, it's evidence. We have facts and stats that show that there's racial disparity at every single stage of the policing and criminal justice system, and yet we can't often see it because race, again, I talked in the beginning, it justifies the world as it is. So we tell ourselves it's because Black people just commit more crimes, and not necessarily looking at the actual disparities that are being practiced regularly. So in my own life, I can attest to some different things that I've seen that have kind of shaped how I think about, especially as it relates to this issue of police brutality, which is, obviously a huge topic these days. My older brother, I talk about in my book, I'll just mention real briefly that he once was arrested. Basically, he was hanging out and he basically fit the description. A police officer came and he fit the description of a Black male with a black t-shirt and blue jeans, only description. And so they picked him up and he spent about 3 months locked up before he was released. They finally put him through a lineup and all. It was clearly not him. But after he was released, it was interesting. I mean, I guess what was interesting for me was just kind of internalizing and making sense of that happening to my own brother, not somebody out there, not somebody else's family, but to my own brother, and to someone, he was a year older than me. Growing up, we shared rooms. He's like my size, my builds, like literally that could have easily been me. I mean, people at times have even said we look like twins. I don't actually think we do, but certainly it could have easily just as likely had been me. And so just one of those things that were eye-opening for me growing up. My younger brother, I have a younger brother that's 9 years younger than me, and he, he's had several encounters. I mean, he still lives out in the suburbs, and in fact, just 2 months ago, he had an encounter where he was dropping off a white friend at their house, and a police officer was like following them, but didn't like turn on the lights or anything. He drops him off. He sits there for a while, not sure, if the police officer is going to pull him over or not. Finally, he decides just to go. So he goes, the cop follows him some more, eventually turns on the light, pulls him over, stops, searches his car and everything. You know what I mean? And it's just humiliating. And just, he's actually had probably the most stuff like that. I don't know. Anyway, and that was just very recent. I've had in my own life, when I lived in Harrisburg, I live in Harrisburg now, but about 10 years ago, I also lived in Harrisburg for a little while, for about 4 years, and I had an experience where I was driving at night through Harrisburg, and a police car came up, stopped me, put the lights on, and then waited, and then a second cop car was across the street and shined a light onto the car, and by this point, I'm thinking, like, what in the world is going on? And so there I am getting kind of scared because it's nighttime. I know there's low visibility and, you hear about all these horrible things happening. And so I wait, and then all of a sudden I see the two police officers from behind me coming out, and they have their guns drawn as they're approaching the car. And I'm just like tensing up and literally scared because I think I could die that night. And I mean, it all ended up working out all right. But so I got home safely that night, but it was just terrifying. And I know I could realize, as I'm pretty much frozen there, realizing how easily things can go bad when people just presume criminality, something wrong from the get-go. I've seen in my neighborhood back in Philly, I've seen my neighbor, like one of my neighbors after he was disorderly, right? He was disorderly. But after he was already arrested, handcuffed, everything, just seeing them, how they were treating him, pushing his face into the cement, like unnecessary physical brutality. And he wasn't violent with anybody. He was drunk and loud that night. And anyway, I could go on and on, but I've just seen so many different ways in which I've seen police profiling and brutality in my community, in my experience. So I want to hopefully wrap up with this so that we can have some time for conversation. I want us to think about what it means for us as Christians to kind of respond to the racialized world that we live in. And I guess I think that Romans 12:1-2 really has something significant for us to think about. Paul says, "Therefore I exhort you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, alive, holy, and pleasing to God, which is your reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this present world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may test and approve what is the will of God, what is good and well-pleasing and perfect." And I guess what I want us to think about is the fact that, first, we're called to present our bodies alive as a sacrifice, right? So first of all, God doesn't want dead bodies, I guess is good news. Not that sometimes our faithfulness might end in the consequence of death, but that's not what God desires. He desires living bodies. And in some sense, then, it means that to present our bodies alive is to say that what we do with our bodies actually matter, right? That whether our bodies are just on the couch every day, or if they get up and they join that march, right, or that protest or that community events where, they're doing organizing or whatever, but what we do with our bodies actually matter. And even more than that, though, on the everyday level, what we do with our bodies matter. That if we live in a racialized society that tells us that, your body belongs in this space, but not that space, and with these people and not those kinds of people, right? Then are we going to be puppets to the racialized world that we live in? How do we embody more faithfully a life that is pleasing to God, in which we disrupt and break out of the patterns, the racialized patterns of our society? And so I think that that's a huge challenge for us, that what we actually do with our bodies matter, and where we place our bodies matter, and who we place our bodies with actually matter. And then, of course, then to get there, right, to not be conformed to this present world, we need to actually have our actual minds renewed. And in this case, that is huge, right? If we have minds that are so racialized, that we internalize these frameworks of racial hierarchy and justify the world as it is, how do we begin to have our minds renewed so that we can be transformed and not participate, not be puppets to the racialized world that we live in? And so I think there's some challenge there for us for thinking about nonconformity, maybe not the way Anabaptists always have, right? But to twist this idea of nonconformity to think specifically about our racialized society and how we can live lives that break out of those cycles and patterns. So that's it. I want to open up for conversation. I guess I'll mention my book, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, which unpacks some of these ideas more. And you can find me Twitter and Facebook and blogging and all that kind of stuff as well. But I'm going to push this off and we'll kind of move towards conversation together.
All right. Well, thank you, Drew. That was fascinating. We've had a few questions here pop up on the group chat button, and if I feel okay if if you guys want to just go ahead and speak up and ask Drew a question directly to get started with. That's fine. Stephen, I see you have a few questions here noted. Do you want to choose one of those questions that you already wrote down to talk with Drew about? Just unmute. There you go.
Yeah, actually, let me scroll through what I wrote down here, and I'll about 30 more seconds.
Sure.
I think the essential one for me is from what I see. So, Dr. Hart, I am a member of a nearly pure white church in a suburb of Seattle, Washington, and is Christian Missionary Alliance Church. And we have a quote-unquote urban branch in downtown Seattle, and we have actually an outreach to the Chinese American community in North Seattle. And the difficulty I've seen in the past 2 years is the connection between these three churches is just about impossible. Some of the pastors do meet with our denominational quarterly meetings, but I don't see any connection. So what I was going to ask is, speaking as a layperson, what do you think are essential ways for lay people in the white community to reach out and connect with our Black brothers and sisters and our Chinese American brothers and sisters, and just the churches that we have in these conglomerations? How do we get that change to happen if our pastors, and this is no slam on pastors, but if our pastors can't do it, how can we make it happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think the great opportunity is that for the church, right, we don't have to just wait for the pastors, that we can be the church, right? And we can gather folks and mobilize folks to do that kind of work. I think probably probably at least my tendency would be to say what probably is more important is not just how to do it, but like what is the preparation before we enter into that, right? And so I think, especially for white churches, there needs to be a lot of catch-up work, right? So sometimes I use the analogy of reading a book. So if I was leading a book study and I'm the only one that's read the whole book and everybody else just looked at the cover and maybe one person read the preface, that can be kind of frustrating, and you're going to have all kinds of, it's not going to be a fruitful conversation, right?
That's exactly what happened when I did this last year. So I was the only one that read the book and no one else had read it. So after 13 weeks, I realized that this was not the way to do it.
Yeah. Well, so the same thing. I mean, I think conversations around race and coming together on race can become difficult when not everyone understands our history as a country. Not everyone understands how things developed in the way that it did. Everyone thinks they know, right? So race is kind of complicated because everyone in their intuition thinks that they're an expert on race. And yet at the same time, most people have not actually taken the time, especially if they're white, they're most likely, least likely to know about how race actually shapes people's everyday lives. And so I think that some of the work would be, first is creating space for the white people to do some intentional readings and study and discussion and having some unsettling experiences that are going to prep them to do that kind of work and engagement with the other churches, do it well, right? So that, because I think the danger sometimes, I've heard too many times where churches who are well-meaning come together and they get frustrated, especially the Black and brown congregations get frustrated, because usually what happens is kind of, the white churches usually take over and they have their way of doing things, and it just kind of falls default, right? That people just kind of, the white normative way of doing things kind of just takes over, and people don't necessarily realize it. It's not bad intention, just that they think that this is the right way to do things, right? And so I think that there's a lot of preparation, cultural intelligence, but also understanding race and the history of race and the way, why, these communities rose up, and even for white communities to just spend time learning about whiteness, right? So if race is a social construct that was developed, why was whiteness developed? How did our communities adopt and internalize this idea that we're white, right? Where does this, how does that shape us as a church? How does that shape our own theology? All kinds of questions to be asking. And how do we break out of these cycles? And are we willing to mutually be transformed by others? What kind of openness is required for that? So anyway, that'd be it's not a complete answer in terms of the method for doing the work itself, because I think there's lots of different ways to do it, right? I don't want to give a cookie cutter answer like there's one way to do it. So I think when it actually gets down to the actual concrete doing it, as long as there's a mutual conversation and openness, and in some ways maybe the best way to avoid the danger of taking over is to be willing to step in and say, we're going to follow your lead, at least to start off in this relationship. We're open to you doing it, the first be the last and last be first, right? That we're willing to take that position in this relationship and kind of grow from there.
Thank you.
Other questions? Just feel free to unmute yourself and just speak on up.
I guess I would say sometimes I struggle with, having the imagination to think of something different, and that sometimes stories of others engaging in ways of not completely obliterating racism. Maybe that seems huge, but what are maybe a story or a moment that you think of where you've really seen a community transcend, or as you put it, like their minds are transformed out of this sort of racialized society and into more of the kingdom of God?
Yeah, I mean, and I wish I had just like hundreds of examples, but hopefully I can give a little something, because there's really rarely few. I mean, and I'll say as a side note, right, that even many multiracial congregations don't offer all that they claim they do, right? That the multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural churches that exist, sometimes they do so on the basis on not dealing with racism, not talking about racial hierarchy, not dealing with the issues that are going around in their communities and society. And so I think there's even dangers of, it can look really good at first because you have all these diverse people in the pews, but what kind of actual transformation's happening if it's always on the terms of keeping everybody who's white comfortable, right? So I think that's one of the dangers. But anyway, to your question though, I was just in Columbus, Ohio, over the weekend, and one of the churches that I spoke at, I also got to connect with one of my friends, Caitlin Hansen, who she probably would, and this is the irony, is she wouldn't want me to highlight her at all. She's a young white female. She actually is a blogger for a blog called By Their Strange Fruit. But she also works for the church, both the church and their nonprofit. Their church is called, Church of All Nations in Columbus. And now I haven't actually been to this church, but I know the church and I know the work that they do. And I think, they kind of, since it's on the top of my mind right now, they kind of represent, I think, a great example of, what the church can be. They are fully capable. They understand race and racism and how that shapes their lives. They're trying to break out of that. They have a racially diverse leadership. They have racially diverse church. They have a socioeconomically diverse church. But even within that, though, it disrupts. Like, it's not that all the wealthy, educated people run things, right? They disrupt that, and they intentionally name those power dynamics and those temptations to normalize what we think is valuable and importance, and who brings things to the table and who doesn't. So they really make sure that they intentionally, they call them the hard living folks, right, who are from the community. Those folks are centralized, kind of like Jesus did with those who are most marginalized in their community, right? And so they kind of emphasize, what does it mean to do life with folks, not for folks, right? As they embody that both in the church and how it does its everyday life, but also through its other ministries in the community as well. And so, that's just one church I think that is doing a lot of great stuff. That's a great witness in its community. And therefore, out of that, then is doing a lot of justice work, broader housing, all kinds of stuff that they're getting into. So you can certainly look them up as one example. There's other churches, that, have pieces here and there and stuff, but there's also a lot of churches that are not doing it well, but think they are. I think there's the temptation of not doing self-examination and being self-aware of the kind of work, of the way that we do our lives, right? How we gather together, how we worship, in what ways you can have racially diverse churches that are still normative, white dominant cultural normative churches. And I think that's the thing, that when we begin to talk about racial hierarchy and the presumption that the white way of doing things is the right way of doing things, right? When we name those things, then I think we can get to a point where it's more mutual. It's a give and share where everybody's culture, what they bring to the table, has some space there as well. So anyway, hopefully that at least partially answered your question. Yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
I think we might have time for one more question. So does anyone else have one more question? Last chance.
I just have the question of, are there resources that you could suggest for working with young people around race, or particularly thinking about as how are we allies as white people, just looking for, what would be either resources or people that we get to talk to or to listen to as we try and engage young people, and for me, young people who are predominantly in white neighborhoods, in upper middle class white neighborhoods. How do we engage them around their privilege and around race?
Yeah, great question. So I don't know if I have any resources off top that is like directly like for young people per se. I mean, I guess, I mean, so some things need translating, right? I guess. Although I'll give a shameless plug, but I think my book is accessible for young folks, I would think. So maybe I'll put that out there. But maybe, I mean, some of it is also just, so what are we exposing kids to, right? What are they, so, I mean, so if they're reading, if we're intentionally exposing them to Black, Brown, Asian, authors and folks who are doing study guides and Bible studies and speakers that we're bringing in, like being intentional, I think on that front is good. I think also experiences can be really powerful. So like there's things like civil rights bus tours, for like a week long where you go on a journey. So maybe instead of sending the white kids out to serve, send them out to learn, right? And it can be really maybe a transformative, unsettlingly transformative experience where, the way that they will look at their country will never be the same because they actually have a little bit more specific, concrete realities of people's experiences through history, right? And so I'll name, so my friend Todd Allen, he leads a civil rights bus tour called Returning to the Roots of the Civil Rights. And I think it's like a 9-day trip through the South. And you actually get to meet people who actually were involved in the civil rights bus tour movements, see the sites, go through museums, and it's just a really powerful time. And so I think something like that also, so along with readings and engagement, in different ways, these kind of experiences can really be powerful. But then again, like I said before, the translating, right? And I think if, so the more that leaders, I think, make that a part of who they are and what they speak just in general, just framing things, giving them some perspective on the world, the more I think the students will also catch some of that, right? Because if we can be socialized in one way, we can also be socialized in good ways as well by those who are implementing us.
Well, thank you, Drew, so much for coming to the Gathering Place today to share your wisdom, to share your hopes, and really challenging message about what does it mean for us as Christians and as churches to understand in a new way the racialized society we live in, and what to do by, if I can quote you, the trouble we've seen. So thank you so much again, and thank you all for participating with The Gathering Place. The Gathering Place continues to change up our themes every month, and this, as well as all previous webinars that we've done monthly, are recorded, so you can go back to our archives and check it out. So thank you again, Drew, for your time tonight, and until next time, thanks for gathering on The Gathering Place. Good night.